Ben Truman has been an Anglican priest for 10 years and currently serves as the Dean of Cardboard Cathedral. He's the father of 3 young boys. Ben is very familiar with conflict and the rare beauty of peace. Having previously been a drama teacher, Ben is interested in the place of story in building common understanding as first step to peace and unity. Please welcome Reverend Ben.
He honore, he kororia ki te atua, he maungaronga ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko auraki te maunga, ko arahura te awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, no mawhirau, no o tautahi toku kāinga i nāianei, ko Ben Truman toko ingoa. Nō reira, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. It is a real delight to be with you this evening. Thank you for giving up some of your time this evening to come and share stories of peace. I'd say share stories because we've got some 15-minute slots from those with a microphone, but we've got 45 minutes over some dinner to do the real work of peace conversations, because it is only when we're engaging with one another that peace can really take root. With that time allotted, I wasn't entirely sure what to talk on. Peace is a very broad subject, and so I wasn't quite sure where to start. And I thought, rather than starting with the obvious place, which is my faith, which is where I get most of my ideas on faith, I decided to start with a previous vocation of mine, which was teaching. For a few short years, I was a drama teacher at Burnside High School. Wonderful, wonderful time. And in the classroom that I went into, someone had already put up some inspirational posters saying something about acting, something about taking on a character. And there was one there that when I left I took with me, because it was such a good quote, from the novelist Ian McEwan. He wrote this: "Imagining what it is like to be someone other than yourself is at the core of our humanity. It is the essence of compassion. It is the beginning of morality." Beautiful quote, let me say it again. Imagining what it is like to be someone other than yourself is at the core of our humanity. It is the essence of compassion and the beginning of morality. I note from that actually my previous vocation and my current one have a rather similar role. In both, we are storytellers. As a priest and as a teacher, particularly of drama, we are storytellers. We are attempting to understand an other, in acting to take on a role, in preaching to understand the needs of a community and speak into that. Stories are the essence of what we are as humans. We are storied people and always have been. Stories are the way we make sense of the world. Stories are the way we make sense of ourselves and of others. Stories are the gateway into understanding, and they are, of course, integral to peace. So, there are 4 stories that I want to dwell on this evening. The first is some ideas from a social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, particularly his book, The Righteous Mind. Then a little bit on violence and conflict in our world, thinking particularly of Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And then a little of my own faith tradition, both in the stories of Jesus and the stories of those who have followed Jesus. So firstly, Jonathan Haidt and The Righteous Mind. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, a wonderful book to read. It is analysing why those at a liberal and conservative end find themselves at conflict with one another. And we see that tension within religions, we see that tension within political parties, we see that tension in most facets of life, this tension between conservative and liberal. And he says that our moral thinking is deeply based in story, but in story created after the fact. That our morality is often an intuitive thing. And so while morality can change and is based in the stories we grow up hearing, our initial reactions in moral circumstances are usually intuitive. But our brains don't like believing that we are not rational creatures. And so our brains quickly try and do the legwork to give us a reason for the action that we've already taken. Haidt talks about an image of an elephant and a rider. Our elephant is the intuition and the rider is the reasoning part of our brain. It might look like the rider's in control, but I tell you it is not. The elephant is the one doing all of the work. And so he uses this and says we create stories for ourselves to make sense of the moral actions we take. And then he looks at 6 different categories of morality. And after a fair bit of exhaustive research, he came to the understanding that liberals and conservatives put different weightings on those 6 factors. So he talks about care and harm, about fairness and cheating, about loyalty and betrayal, about authority and subversion, about sanctity and degradation, and about liberty and oppression. And those on the more liberal end of the spectrum put a really high degree of importance on care and harm and on liberty and oppression. Those are the 2 significant strands of liberal morality. Conservative morality is a little bit more broad-based. They have a fairly even weighting of those 6 concepts. But there's a decline in the care and harm. So that goes down as the others come up. Some really interesting ideas around why we believe what we believe and how we can tell stories to engage those who are different from us. Often when we are telling stories with those that we disagree with or trying to persuade those that we disagree with, we focus on one of those elements of morality that we're particularly passionate about. Haidt's research says that can be foolish because they might put a different weighting on that particular element. There is a need to know how another thinks and to tell stories and engage where they are rather than perhaps where you are. So a really interesting set of research around that from Jonathan Haidt that helps me know what stories I might be able to tell to engage deeply in peace with others. Peace is a difficult word. Thank you, Nolene, for sharing some of that richness of peace, because it must be more than simply the absence of war. And our English word peace can be a little bit too clean and simplistic, I think. Usually when I'm preaching on peace, I go to the Hebrew word shalom, which has a much broader and deeper and wider sense of peace. The word Islam is the same, of course, that deep, broad sense of peace that is more than simply the absence of war, but is the totality of peace, a place and a sense that all is as it ought to be. Only then do we fully have peace. And I thought of that with our recent hikoi mō te tiriti, as an example of how that sense of peace can be seen. Hopefully you, like I, have been curious and or inspired by the work of those who have been travelling up or travelling down to Wellington. Many have called it a peaceful protest, and indeed that is what it has been. Incredibly well organised, using the best of the history of peaceful movements from Parihaka and elsewhere. Incredibly well disciplined and peaceful, lots of singing, lots of discipline. But it's not a fully peaceful event in that they are dealing with injustice. They are calling out what doesn't create peace, which is the threat of having rights taken away, rights that have been long established since 1840. And so, yes, it is a peaceful protest, but it is also a protest that shows the lack of peace in this conversation. And then, I don't know if you caught the 6 o'clock news, but listening to those parties talk about what they saw and what they felt, they are talking past each other. There is no sense of the shared story. They have not understood where the other is coming from. There is storytelling, but it's storytelling for their own advantage rather than to deeply engage with another. So, Haidt's ideas of sharing stories that actually engage with one another and seeing that in our own very recent history. I want to talk a little on peace and war, peace and non-violence. There's a wonderful book by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. It was put out in 2011. And in that book, he shows that violence has decreased significantly through the years. However, of course, it still remains for us. But we are generally a less violent world than we have been in the past. However, some of the book hasn't aged particularly well. He wrote in 2011, "I also don't expect war between developed countries to make a comeback anytime soon." It grieves me that he was wrong on that count. He recognises that civil wars, terrorist acts, government repression and genocides will continue because they are more isolated in their genesis. But unfortunately, we have seen a pickup of war between developed countries in recent years. Even if we may have seen less violence as a world, I don't think we are a more peaceful place. We have less violence except for the obvious pockets, but we have growing inequality, we have growing fundamentalism and extremism, both in faith and in non-faith ideologies, and we have growing tribalism in online echo chambers. Whilst we might have less physical violence, the breeding ground for violence is expanding ever more every year. We have a need for more stories of peace. Those echo chambers online are dangerous because it is there that stories are told to reinforce preconceptions. There is a blurry line between anecdote and evidence. There is a blurry line between truth and fiction, and that will only become worse with AI, images and video, where we can create the thing that we wish to see and then disseminate even if there is no substance behind it. The stories we tell ourselves feed into our morality and feed into the peace or the lack thereof that we have in our world. I'm fascinated by America, where they have recently voted in Trump again, and it makes no sense to me that the major base for that has been working class people who have voted against their best interests, in my opinion, for someone that will give tax cuts to the wealthy rather than to those who have voted him in. The reason they do that is because in America they hold to a deep story that they will one day be the rich person who gets the tax cut. The story that they tell themselves allows them to vote against their best interests because they long for and they hope to be one of those people who achieves that fabled American dream. And yet the research shows that there is very limited social movement in America today. So we have a decrease in violence, but an increase in a lack of deeper peace. We have stories that talk past each other. So what does a modern pathway to peace look like? It is in sharing stories that speak to the people who hear them. And that brings me finally to faith. In my tradition, of course, Jesus is the storyteller. The Gospels are full of parables. That was Jesus' favourite mode of teaching, was to tell stories. The lost sheep, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, all of these are pointing to deep, deep peace. But he's also the one that lives out those stories and becomes a living story himself, washing the feet of the disciples, something that was immensely shameful in the culture, but a wonderful sign of his grace. Jesus standing silent before Pilate, allowing himself to go down the path of crucifixion, showing us a non-violent way. Chastising his disciple when he draws a sword in the garden. These are the stories that can slowly bring about a change in morality, a change in the breeding ground for peace. I'm in a liturgical church that tells some of these stories in the service itself each week. A passing of the peace just before we come up for communion, a blessing of peace at the end of the service. And all of this points us to our own stories of lived faith. And so let me end with a story of Tādore. Some of you will know the story of Tādore. I'm hoping that most of you don't, so that it's new and that you won't be able to know that I'm extending the truth or forgetting some things. Hugh, feel free to yell out if I'm getting anything wrong. 1835. Two missionaries, Alfred and Charlotte Brown, begin a missionary school. And there they teach young Māori children to read and write in their language, in Te Reo Māori. One of the girls who receives that education is Tādore. Please note, this is fantastic that a woman is receiving education and not always done. Tādore learns to read and learns to write. And she gets given a translation of the Gospels according to Luke, a small wee book that she holds in a pouch around her neck. And she takes those stories and reads them to the rest of her village, so that they come to know the stories of Jesus' peace as well. One day, a raiding party comes. It comes at night, the family gets dispersed, and Tādore is killed. The killer of Tādore takes all of the things of value from those who he has killed, including Tādore's little gospel book, Te Rongopai. He takes that away with him as part of the spoils of war. But when he takes it back to his village, there are others who teach him and other villagers to read. And there they read stories that change their understanding, stories that change their morality, stories that speak of peace. And so, eventually, Tādore's killer seeks Ngākuku, Tādore's father, to ask for forgiveness. It was an incredibly dangerous and courageous act, because there is every expectation that this man will be killed. But Ngākuku, Tādore's father, remembers the stories of the gospel, and instead of seeking revenge, seeks peace. And here the father of a murdered girl and her murderer make amends. It is a remarkable story in our history. And it continues to grow. That is then taken to Otaki, to a marae there, where the story is shared once more, shared with Te Rauparaha, who has a terrible history down south. He becomes a follower of faith. He shares those stories with his son, Tamihana Te Rauparaha, who comes and shares the gospel in the South Island. Stories are the pathway to peace. Stories are the only way that we can truly connect and change. However, the power of stories is double-edged. We can tell the stories and find the stories that we want to continue to reinforce our own ideas, or we can hear the stories and share the stories that lead us to a deeper peace, deeper connection, and a deeper humanity. I am glad that there are stories in our nation's history that speak of that deeper peace. Kia ora.